But now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Schillinger. Dr. Schillinger is chief of the Division of General Medicine in San Francisco General Hospital. He also founded the Center for Vulnerable Populations there at the UCSF, the University of California, San Francisco, as well as he directs the Health Communication Research Program. And I'm really excited to have him here because he has one of my favorite, I do a lot in public health and have taught in public health for about 20 years. And he has one of my favorite public health programs because I don't know about you, but if you know the rule in health literacy, the golden rule is to not only know your audience, but co-create with that audience. And some of the stuff that's coming out of the bigger picture is just incredible because it's the audience creating that voice and sharing that with their other community members. Well, I'd like to welcome Dr. Schillinger. Thank you so much.
First of all, Stan and crew, thank you so much for inviting me. It was tight. I had clinic on Monday morning, literally got on the plane, and then start attending on the wards at San Francisco General tomorrow. So I'm glad I was able to squeeze in. It's also great to see a bunch of old friends here, people coming up saying, oh, I remember we met in 2003 at the Institute for Healthcare Advancement Conference, and I must say we've all aged quite a bit, but you guys look fantastic. I've aged, you guys look great. So today's session, I'm going to ask that it will be a little bit interactive. So there will be a couple of moments when I will ask you to actually engage. And if you choose to do so, and if you don't make me point and call out your name, use one of the microphones, because we got 1, 2 here, or shout out. Either one is fine. So today I'm going to share with you some of the work that we've been doing over the last decade in the San Francisco Bay Area and more recently across the state of California, related to a campaign that Stan alluded to, the Bigger Picture campaign, which is a diabetes prevention campaign focused on halting the very frightening trajectory we are seeing with respect to type 2 diabetes occurring now in children and youth. And the talk is entitled The Power of Community Voice, Enhancing Public Health Literacy for Vulnerable Populations. So the 4 objectives of my session is to define public health literacy, which for some people will sound like a new term, and often people are like, oh, you mean public health literacy? No, it's public health literacy. So define that. Both as a construct in and of itself, as well as in relation to what many of us consider individual level health literacy. And then describe the communication content and medium employed in a public health literacy campaign that, as Stan mentioned, has been co-created with community youth. I hope that you will begin to appreciate some of the emergent behavioral and communication theories that form the basis of the messaging. And I'll say right now, we did not go into this project with a priori pre-existing communication and behavioral theories. I'm actually pretty theory agnostic. This theory emerged from the authentic voices of the young people creating their pieces, and we were able to understand thematically what theoretically was going on in their hearts and minds that appeared to be so effective from a communication perspective, and so post hoc are describing these theories. And then lastly, share, because I know a number of you have seen some of the films before and heard me speak on this, I wanted to share some new research that we have done related to what we've learned about how to optimize the general public's response to the very unique public health literacy content that the campaign features. As you probably know, the type 2 diabetes epidemic in America, as it relates to the increasing burden of illness in young people, is primarily, if not exclusively, a problem of minority subgroups and low socioeconomic status groups, so-called vulnerable populations. And the word vulnerable populations, the words vulnerable populations are appearing a number of times in the today's agenda and as well as tomorrow's. And I just want to give you my definition of vulnerable populations, because it's sort of like, how many definitions there are for love. It's like, it depends who you ask. But, and there is some pejorative nature to the words vulnerable populations, because it's really a deficit-based construct, not one that builds on the assets that all people and all communities have. So I want to frame this really as an epidemiologic issue. And epidemiologists, as you know, are scientists who see the world like you're doing a Sudoku puzzle, right? And which I don't do. But they see patterns and associate the patterns of risk with disease outcomes. So the definition that I've created is vulnerable populations are a range of subgroups of the larger population that, because of social, economic, political, structural, geographic, and historical forces, are exposed to a greater risk of risks and are thereby at a disadvantage with respect to their health and their health care. So epidemiology is all about relative risk. It's really not about disease. It's about the risk factors that drive disease. So vulnerable populations are those because of external forces shaped primarily by the society in which they find themselves, are exposed to a greater risk of risks. So to make this very concrete, I can give you an example from a paper I read a few years ago in JAMA, which was a simple description of the degree of secondhand smoke exposure, which you would all agree is a health risk, measurable in children in America. So what these investigators did as part of the NHANES, the large federal annual or biannual survey, is they drew blood and urine samples from children in the United States of all races, ethnicities, incomes, geographies. And they simply wanted to measure the metabolite, the byproduct of nicotine, which is cotinine. So you can measure serum and urine cotinine and determine which children have been exposed in the last few days to presumably secondhand smoke. These were small children. As well as determine the levels of serum cotinine to assess the intensity of that exposure. And obviously exposure to secondhand smoke when one is a child is a risk factor for the development of asthma in the short term and cardiovascular disease and stroke in the longer term. So it's an important risk factor. And what they found was very stark differences in levels of serum cotinine. Among low-income African American children, the prevalence of measurable serum cotinine approached 50%. Among high-income white children, it was less than 3%. If you then looked at high-income African Americans, it was about 20%, and low-income white children, it was, I think it was about 12 or 15%. So you see a couple of things at play. You see how differential exposure to risk is differentially distributed, in this case by race, ethnicity, and income. And this being an environmental exposure. These are not children who are going out to the corner store and buying cigarettes. And you're seeing the synergistic effect of two vulnerabilities conspiring together to elevate risks. So poverty and minority status. So this is very characteristic of the experience and exposures of vulnerable populations as defined here. Now, moving closer to the issue of public health literacy, I just want to remind ourselves of why this concept is so antithetical to the way people in America think about health. Public health literacy really relies on the construct of the socio-ecological model of health. Can I see a raise of hands for people who understand the term, recognize the term socio-ecological model of health? Okay, a little over half. So for those who don't, this basically is a a way of thinking about how health is generated in communities and in individuals as a function not only of the individual's genetic makeup and behavioral choices, but also a function of the family in which they live, the schools in which they attend, the neighborhoods in which that they inhabit, the cities that host that neighborhood and the policies therein, the country, all the way up to the Milky Way, okay? So that individual behaviors, for example, are shaped as much by the environment and the social norms created by culture and policy as much as individual choices. So when we say, let's make the right choice the easy choice, we are invoking the socio-ecological model of health. So it's a multi-level model of health that requires the average American to think outside of his or her box of individual choice and personal responsibility to recognize that much larger forces of concentric circles are at play in determining health. Now, just to give you an example of how antithetical the socio-ecological model of health is, I'll give you the example from diabetes. And this is a study of US media content related to type 2 diabetes. These investigators looked at all the newspaper and television articles and programs that highlighted the diabetes epidemic in America. And their study revealed that only 12% of these articles mentioned social or environmental contributors to the rising diabetes epidemic. The vast majority focused on individual choices, bad choices that the lazy poor people are making, the unhealthy behaviors that they implement, or the bad genes with which they were cursed to be born with. Now we know from a lot of both clinical and public health research that the diabetes epidemic in America is primarily a social epidemic. Certainly 25 years ago, if I saw a child with type 2 diabetes in my clinic, people would be like, wow, that's a New England Journal of Medicine paper right there, Dean. Go write that up. And now it's, it's almost a dime a dozen. So these children's genes did not change overnight, yet the persistence of the genetic hypothesis in type 2 diabetes is quite striking. So moving to public health literacy, a construct really first laid out by Dr. Friedman in 2009 has been defined as the degree to which individuals and groups can obtain, process, understand, evaluate, and act upon information needed to make public health decisions that benefit the community. So as opposed to individual health literacy, this is a degree to which individuals and groups act on information to make public health decisions at levels beyond the individual and involving the socio-ecological model and those concentric circles that benefit the community. A great example of this, I see some gray hair in the room, so you probably remember the days when smoking was prevalent. 40% of America smoked, and people were smoking in the airplanes, they were smoking in restaurants, I don't know what the laws are in Wisconsin, but my mother was smoking in the car when I was a child. So it wasn't really until the discovery that secondhand smoke can kill, a very interesting series of natural experiments actually, and validated by some basic science, that the general public began to understand that, if you smoke, my child gets asthma, or if you smoke, I can get cancer, that suddenly the public health literacy of the average American skyrocketed, and suddenly we began to make decisions as a society that constrained individual choice in favor of community benefit. And that was a gigantic leap at the time. It's been estimated that over 1 billion lives have been saved as a result of that over the course of the last 30 years. And it ran counter to the American way of thinking. So I'm going to riff on public health literacy for the rest of my talk. And I want to quote Paulo Freire. Another show of hands, how many people know Paulo Freire? This is great. It's a health literacy conference, so I'd say about 1 in 5. Sorry for the gendered statement, but he is considered the grandfather, and I'm sure there is a grandmother. I'd love to have a grandmother slide up here too, of literacy pedagogy. How do we teach people to read? And his view of reading was quite grandiose and understood how literacy really can lead to power. He said in his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, so if you want to have a couple of take-homes today, get a copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed if you can find one. He said that education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. That's what he thinks education and literacy is about. It's about moving from a logic of conformity to a logic of transformation. And with that in mind, I want to share with you one of the poems that we filmed that is on the Bigger Picture website. This poem was written by a 17-year-old after attending a workshop that we put on around the diabetes epidemic in youth in California, based on his own life and based on the setting in which he lives, which is Stockton, California. Stockton is in the Central Valley of California, the fruit basket of the world, with an extremely high rate of type 2 diabetes, including in children. And when I want you to really engage with this piece of art. It's about 4 minutes long. Remembering it was written by a 17-year-old. The filming, he helped do the choreography and create the scene for, but a professional filmmaker who's also a poet did the film. But what I'd like to ask you to do, and there will be a Q&A in which I'll ask you to answer this, is first of all, to think about sort of your gut and your heart, okay? Don't go all public health and academic on me. What did the video poem make you feel? And this doesn't necessarily mean a feel-good moment. It could, whatever you feel. We'd just like to hear about it and why. And then, once we do the heart and the gut, we'll go to the head, and I'll ask, what public health message do you think Anthony Orozco, the poet here, was trying to convey about the diabetes epidemic or about his life? I'll just tell you that we had the good fortune of having a New York Times feature story on the Bigger Picture campaign that included 4 live links to videos that these young people made, and his was one that was featured in that, and that was on Valentine's Day 2018.
From 1962 to the end of the Delano Great Boycott, Cesar Chavez led a movement against agricultural inequality. The United Farm Workers of America empowered Mexicanos bent over from Bakersfield to Lodi, standing united against the mistreatment of the people responsible for feeding this nation. Abuela y abuelos, tías, tíos, primos y hermanos, who pick, process, and pack the produce their pockets couldn't afford to begin with. Backs breaking, bones aching, harvesting healthy fruits and veggies, the bounty of California's breadbasket that almost never blessed the tables of far middle families. When I was 13, my belly was a clenched fist, protesting days without a proper meal, couch cushion diving, trying to find as much change a boy with no job possibly could. Knowing in the pit of my empty, growling stomach that $2 burgers and 50-cent sodas just wouldn't do it anymore. My grandfather, changing from picker to pickpocket, even if you gotta rob and steal from chumps for their change, just see it as them paying for you, your friends, your family to eat. Even as the grease from them fries begins to choke you. No looking past the poisons Chicanos swallow. Type 2 diabetes leaves us blinded, numbed, and dismembered. They make food manufactured to control our population. Death grip on your manhood. Erectile dysfunction affects us at twice the rate of güeros. We eat this crustacean because we have no choice. Brown body shut down and deteriorated by the toxins poverty forces down your throat. But as long as you have something that feels like food in your mouth, you won't complain. Stockton sits in the middle of an obscene agricultural abundance, but us, we live where fast food chains trap us like chain links on a prison yard. Our shackles cast and forged by poverty itself. We, the intentional inmates of the South Side, where Charter Way was known as death row for different reasons over many years, it's practically multiple choice today. Being murdered or choosing death by diet, demise by diabetes, a decision between 8 spots 3 blocks apart, my tío. As a little chavalito learned how Mexicanos in the fields did their math, adding up 5 cents a cherry to however many he could fit into his basket, minus the throwaways, minus the ones too small, minus the ones not ripe enough. He brought home $15 a day, praying the division of his labor would work to feed a family of 7, and here I am, history unchanged, attempting to stretch $2 change as far as possible to buy as much as possible, like broke families have done for centuries. Sometimes I wonder if there's any difference between counting cherries or change anymore. If it's any more worth digging through cut up couches, rather searching through branches that fell off on their own. Sometimes I wonder if I could pick the stars out of the night, would my wishes really come true? If I were to pick the sun out of the sky and seize this food from growing, whose plate would be more empty, whose belly would hurt more? The pickers are those we pick for. Because it seems like no matter how much produce I pick, no matter how much profit gets counted, nobody will ever truly have enough. And everybody's got to eat.
So you can clap for the poets if you want. Yeah. Let me just, before we go to the interactive thing, let me just tell you a few things about Anthony Orozco. So I first met him when we did the workshop in Stockton. He was 15 years old. And you know, sometimes in these workshops there are 6 to 10 kids, and there's always 1 or 2 who kind of just don't engage, and 1 or 2 who really engage, and then everybody else is in between. And he was one who really engaged. And I'll never forget, he told a story. Well, we actually have in the workshop a time when people sort of draft the first draft of a poem, and it's, you know, a very accepting group, and you can throw anything out there. And he read a very short poem. It was about 4 sentences long, and it was about visiting his father in the Stockton prison, which he does weekly, because his father's been in prison for most of Anthony's life. And him telling us that He knows he can always get an apple once a week because his father brings him an apple because they give him apples in prison. That's the one time he gets an apple. And I was like, that is just an insane vision, that to get an apple, you need to have a father who's in prison because they give the prisoners apples. The second thing is, Anthony now is 20. He works in Stockton in a canning factory that cans sugar-sweetened beverages and beer and the ones that make the aluminum cans. And his job is to paint the machinery, to keep the machinery looking spotless. And the good news is he just got married. So he's 20 and he's happily married. What did the video make you feel? What did the poem make you feel? So it was liberating in that way. It opened up your mind, which is kind of Freirean, right? It's like, let's look at things in a different transformative way. And what part of your mind was opened? Now you're doing heart and gut by talking about your mind, but I'll give it to you. What part of your mind, let's go with the part that is associated with the limbic system, which is associated with emotions. What part of that opened for you? So I want to point that out, that the first reaction we've heard was one of anger and frustration. And I just want to put out to you, how many of you have been involved in public health campaigns whose objective is to make someone angry or frustrated? It's not like that, right? We don't do that. So just hold that thought. Any other emotional responses? And it sounds like you were more activated with that. Yeah. Trapped. Okay, so you felt trapped and helpless, right? Okay. What did he show you that made you feel trapped and helpless? What did you see or hear?
Kind of a progression of, the worker and what happens with the family.
The intergenerational
And then,
transfer of that.
Him looking at the apple and going for the hamburger.
Uh-huh. So trapped in the food desert, right? Trapped in the food desert, which is, if you go to Stockton, that really is what it looks like. That is Stockton, which is part of the power of these videos. The kids make videos of the corners in which they live. They're not going to Hollywood and making a video. This is not the Truth Campaign, which was the Madison Avenue, anti-tobacco campaign. This is like my backyard. I'm going to film my backyard.
It was a great video because you're walking in his shoes. That's per se.
Yeah, you're walking in his shoes, absolutely. So another negative reaction, feeling trapped and helpless. Guilty. Who said that? Okay, I thought you might be of my ethnicity when you said that, but I can't tell. Guilty, because we're part of the system, or?
Guilty because I have access to good food, I have access to healthy food, and I need to know that my food is coming from someone who's working hard and who can't get that food.
Okay, so what's interesting about what you're raising is what you saw there was his calling out the social injustice. And presumably you're here because you're someone who likes to be just. And so the social injustice you internalized. Great. Did anybody feel anything affirmative? Oh, wow, a lot. Shout out some emotions.
Pride. He was proud of his grandparents, his parents, his uncles and his aunts, because they're providing the food for people across the country.
So pride for their resilience and for their productivity and ability to nurture the rest of the nation. Other affirmative.
The young guy who is articulate and can bring it to everybody's attention.
Right. So what do we usually think of young Latino guys in the Central Valley? How do they end up stereotypically, right? This is not. Now, you speaks love to say, we don't want to hear anybody again say, look at that young person of color being so artistic and creative. But yet, it is very refreshing to see a young person literally overnight begin to critically appraise a problem that is so ubiquitous but invisible to him and his own community, and to call these things out. It is empowering in a way, right? I think that's kind of what you're saying. Now, I'm going to shift gears. I know there were a lot of hands, which is great. You guys are awesome. What was his message or messages? Public health message. So now you're going to the brain and you're thinking like an advertising consultant. What was he trying to say? Maricel.
I was thinking that, is this on?
Yeah.
I was thinking, you know, the first time I went into a bookstore and those stuffed toys, and one of them was like the HPV, and you were able to, the Giardia, the polio, the little stuffed toys that people put out there, and you're sort of, oh my gosh, this is so funny. Who would have thought of putting polio into a bean baby? This is the idea. Who raps about erectile dysfunction? Who raps about diabetes? And so the public health message against your 12% slide earlier makes me think, this is not my voice. I don't rap about diabetes. I write articles, I teach in schools, but this is this child's voice, and that's what gives it its integrity. And I think it's actually a discomfort. It feels like, oh, I don't think I can do that. Or who in here in this room would feel comfortable with this playing in their clinic lobby? You know, who would do that? And it's that message is that in your face, that is his message too. So, you know.
So from a public health literacy standpoint, you'd say his message is, we have a voice, we're not being heard,
But it's also
listen.
the format, it's the genre, it's the
Okay.
format that it comes in.
Which is the merging of art and public health, the merging of,
Yeah, and it's not a JAMA article. Like,
Uh-huh.
there's some in the room that will
so you're focusing on the medium, I would say. Okay, so that's, the medium is the message. Somebody said that? Okay, others. Thank you, Maricel.
I heard you saying, don't blame us for having type 2 diabetes. I come from a line of family members that are working extremely hard to provide for their family. And if all there is available is the McDonald's, that's what they're going to provide because they need to put food.
They had to fill their belly. So I would say that if you look at across all the bigger picture videos, that is the core message. This is stop blaming me. I have very constrained choices and options. This is a social problem. This is something that requires the average American to think about the socio-ecological model of health and disease. So that, I would say, is the uber message across all of these, which was never something that I said, hey, you guys, here's the concentric circles of the socio-ecological model. Make sure you've got a poem that's here and a poem that's there, right? This was just them talking about how they integrated the information we were presenting to their own lives. At You Speaks, which is the organization that is the poetry mentoring organization, they say one thing to their kids, and that is that life as primary text. Your life as the primary text. Not Dean's lecture on diabetes or the JAMA article or whatever. Or Kobe Bryant's commercial on whatever. Your life is primary text. Any other public health literacy messages you heard? Yeah.
There's something in opposites here. He and his ancestors have been very much working and getting this produce to other people, but they can't even afford it.
So the paradox, right? It's the paradox of being the ones who are enriching the lives, getting back to your guilt complex, enriching the lives and promoting the health of those who are more fortunate than he, and not being able to have access to that, which gets back to the monopoly point. Yeah, there's a lot wrapped in there, and I'll share with you another video in a bit. Thank you for being so engaging. You may be wondering, or maybe not, but for the purpose of this talk, I will say you may be wondering, how does Anthony and his 15, 16, 17-year-old peers actually become engaged in thinking about the diabetes epidemic? This is not something that young people typically talk about, certainly not type 2 diabetes, right? If you have type 1, you know, the kind where I like to say it's the autoimmune disease. It's the disease in which the body fights against the pancreas. You stop making insulin, the body fights against itself. Type 2 diabetes is the body politic fighting against the child, where the way our society is structured destroys the child's metabolism. So kids typically talk about type 1 because they have seen a lot of it and they see their friends injecting themselves with insulin and they learn about it. But type 2, that's behavioral and we don't want to talk about that. So the way we engage the young people in this first is through visual aids. This is a map of the city and county of San Francisco where I live. This is one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest cities in America. It also obviously has great disparities in income. And I'll just point out where I live and where Maricel lives is in the Richmond district, up here just north of Golden Gate Park. You know, it used to be a middle-class neighborhood. There is no such thing in San Francisco anymore because of the housing prices, but it would look to you like a typical residential neighborhood in the city where you live. My hospital, San Francisco General Hospital, is down here in the southeast corner. Now, let's see if I can advance this. Yes. This is a map of the per capita income in San Francisco with the lighter colors representing poverty. And I want you to take a note of the upside down T, which really represents the poorest parts of San Francisco City and County. These are folks making between $10,000 and $27,000 a year, which I can tell you in San Francisco buys you a couple of apples. So this is the distribution of income in San Francisco. Now this is the distribution of soda expenditures in San Francisco, ranked by national, at a national level. So those in the dark blue areas here represent consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages that are in the top 80th to 100th percentile in the United States. And as you can see, the upside-down T that we saw related to lower income is replicated here in total soda expenditures. And now if you look at the rate of diabetes hospitalization per 10,000 people, this is over a 2-year period of time, and here the outcome is going to be hospitalizations for amputation, acute kidney failure, coma, kind of really bad things in type 2 diabetes. These aren't heart attacks and stroke because they don't get counted even though they're caused by diabetes. These are the acute diabetes complications. You'll see again the upside down T. Here, if we compare my neighborhood, the Richmond district here, 6 to 10 people per 10,000 were hospitalized for an acute diabetic crisis, type 2 diabetes. Whereas in the hospital region where I work, down here, you have, what is that, 40 to 70, something like that. In Pacific Heights, in the marina, you've got 3 to 4. So you have a 10-fold difference in hospitalization rates in one city that actually has universal health care. It's one of the cities that has universal health care. So this is a consequence of higher prevalence of type 2 diabetes as well as lower access to care and quality of care as a result, even though I do work at this hospital. But when you're overwhelmed, your waiting rooms are overwhelmed with people with type 2 diabetes, and where we just had to open a limb salvage unit, which is a clinic that meets twice a week to prevent amputations in people with diabetes with foot ulcers, you know that you cannot provide high quality care. So that we show this to the young people, and inevitably someone says, wait a minute, I live here. Why, just because I live here, do I have more problems than if I live here? And so they begin to start thinking about place and setting and neighborhood and marketing environment and all the things that are leading their families and neighborhoods to look like a war zone with all the amputees in wheelchairs, which they've been seeing all along but never critically reflecting on. So diabetes really is the 21st century epidemic. I was on a run in El Paso, and I happened to pass this. Has anybody seen this? This is one of the fastest growing franchises in America. It's the Costco of diabetes. If 1 in 7 adults has diabetes, which is what it is now in America, damn right you're going to open up a store to cater to them and to their family and caregivers. So, you know, we now have not just a medical industrial complex, but a commercial industrial complex to deal with this epidemic. Now, here's some shocking facts. 10 years ago, only 1 in 11 youth had prediabetes. That's a blood sugar higher than normal, but not meeting the threshold of diabetes. 10 years later, nearly 1 in 4 youth, again, who we're talking about ages 12 to 19, has prediabetes. It's estimated, the CDC estimates that a young person born today has about a 33% chance of developing type 2 diabetes over their lifetime. If you're a child of color, it's 50%. So of these 1 in 4, about half of these youth will go on within the next 10 years or so to develop frank type 2 diabetes. So really, literally a tsunami. Here's another frightening graph. I'm going to come down again. So this is the change in the incidence in diabetes by diabetes type. Remember I said there's type 1 diabetes, which is the autoimmune disease, body fights itself, and type 2, the body politic fights the child. So this is the change over a 10-year period of time by different ethnic groups. And I'm sorry, this is New England Journal of Medicine, but they actually did black for black, red for Native Americans, yellow for Asians. I'm like, you're really kidding me? All right, so making it easy for the reader? I don't know what to say, but in the 10-year period displayed here, the rates of type 1 diabetes over time have not changed. And there are differences between the race ethnicities in the incidence of type 1 diabetes. It is an immune-mediated illness. And so that's not surprising. There are genetic predispositions. We know from twin studies that there is overlap. But what's striking here is the change in the incidence of type 2 diabetes among youth. You can see that among white children, here in blue, because white people are blue, there's been no change over time, whereas among Asians, Latinos, African Americans, and American Indians, the rates have increased by 50% to 300% over the last 10 years. It's all those Pima Indian genes, right? That's what's going on here. The 10 years, those genes have just revved up. So something clearly is going on here. And as Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead used to say, and it's just pathetic that it's us who's got to do something about it. He did say that, actually, but it was about the Vietnam War. Another way of displaying this is from the search study from the CDC. This represents the distribution of type 1 and type 2 diabetes, type 1 in yellow, type 2 in purple, by different ethnic groups. On your left, non-Hispanic whites, African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Pacific Islanders, and American Indians. And as you can see, among white youth, new cases of diabetes predominantly are the autoimmune type. Body fights itself, whereas among children of color, it's the predominant diabetes is the body politic fighting against the child, type 2 diabetes. So what to do about it? I just said it's pathetic that it has to be us, but getting to Maricel's point, we thought we needed to talk about this in a different way. When I was chief of diabetes prevention control for the state of California, I did that for 5 years. I saw these charts, I saw these graphs, and I was going to the governor, Schwarzenegger, I was going to the head of the health department, I was talking to assemblymen and women, and nobody really seemed to care. I was doing my p-values and my graphs and my charts, and I realized that I just was not, even though purportedly I was the diabetes czar, it was really meaningless. And I felt that we needed a different way to engage constituents and policymakers. Now, Augusto Boal, who has heard of him? Oh my God, yay, 3 people. So he's the Paulo Freire, he's also Brazilian, he studied with Paulo Freire, of the arts. So his work in performance art, remember Paulo Freire wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Boal wrote The Theater of the Oppressed. And he created a movement in Brazil and internationally around using the arts for social change, specifically the dramatic arts. And he described that as always seeking the transformation of society in the direction of liberation of the oppressed. This theater, the performance, is both action in itself, and a preparation for future actions. It is not enough to interpret reality, it is necessary to transform it. So if you think about Anthony's poem as a performance, ask yourself, is he seeking the transformation of society in the direction of liberation? Is it an action in and of itself? Does he interpret reality, and does he move forward in an attempt to transform it? So he really inspired the bigger picture work, this theater of the oppressed. And the idea is to bring a public health communication entity from our center with Youth Speaks, which is an arts organization that promotes spoken word and literacy and civic engagement among low-income youth of color. Our missions overlapped around equity and the chronic disease risks that young people face, and so we decided to bring the chocolate and the peanut butter together and set off asking, how can we engage young people to tell their stories as it relates to this epidemic? And as it turns out, so many things lead to diabetes: stress, violence, trauma, food insecurity, that almost every young person's life could be connected to the diabetes epidemic campaign. We carry out these medically curated workshops done by me or a colleague, as well as a more senior poet mentor, with the goal of encouraging young people to create their own spoken word videos and poems, the best of which get selected to be turned into videos that go onto the website. We now have almost 30 public service announcement videos, each about 4 minutes long, on the website, as well as a toolkit and lesson plans. Now, the hidden theory, this was not the a priori theory, we didn't have an a priori theory. The hidden theory that emerged from the bigger picture strategy and from the poems themselves are the following. One can view each of these 30 poems and quite easily detect one of 4 themes arising, and each of these themes tap into deeply held values of adolescence. How many of you have or have had an adolescent in your life? How many of you once were an adolescent? How come nobody raised their hand? Anyway, that's because you were so drugged out you have no memory of it. Anyway, each poem taps into deeply held youth values, such as autonomy. You know, you've had teenager, autonomy and defiance against authority. This is something that almost defines adolescence, right? So here, the authority is the monopolies, the corporate structures, the 4 companies that control the food market and the beverage market, for example. Another deeply held youth value: Mom, it's not fair. You're being hypocritical. So fairness and justice, getting back to your point about injustice, is a ubiquitously, if not entirely shared value of young people. It's why many of them are so engaged in the environmental movement. The third is the value of serving, kind of transforming from youth to adulthood, thinking about their role as protectors of their friends and family. This is something that young people really are attracted by and deeply feel. And I think you saw that in Anthony's video as well. And then lastly, the value of identifying with the other, right? This idea of affiliation. And what's so compelling about these poets is there's something very cool about the poets, no matter what they look like and sound like, that makes a young person, and maybe us adults, want to, even, I'm interested in what you said, Maricel, want to affiliate, want to identify with, even though it may be uncomfortable for us. There is something very attractive, and I think you talked about sort of the pride and seeing him step out, that speaks to youth's values around affiliation and identity. And many of these poets actually represent a whole rainbow of identities: gender, race, ethnicity, etc. And again, if any of you have teenagers now, identity politics is what it's all about. How many of you have ever had to create a logic model? So you know what logic models are and how painful but helpful they are. I just want to point out that in our short-term outcomes, right smack in the middle, right here, we have, as a short-term outcome, activation via youth values, defiance against authority, social and communal justice, personal identification. So one of the short-term outcomes is to activate people, not just youth, by engaging with these deeply held and quite affirmative youth values. So this poem by Tatiana Willis was also 17 when she wrote it, was also in the New York Times. She was the cover photo in the New York Times article. It's called The Longest Mile, and I'll let it speak for itself.
I went to Roosevelt Middle School. My daily routine was to wake up hungry, walk to the bus stop, past McDonald's, the liquor stores, past Popeyes, past the first Burger King, catch the 38 to the second Burger King, order my favorite round hash browns, and watch the young brown bodies drool. And I don't know if we loved Burger King or just loved not being hungry anymore. Because breakfast before school wasn't a requirement, but having to focus through 6 periods was. During PE, I remember we had to run the mile. But luckily, my first year, that turned into laps on our medium-sized area on the roof. I jogged, skipped mostly. But my second year, we had to run a mile around Rossi Park. I had already alerted my teachers that this was going to be my revolutionary act to walk the mile. Truth is, my asthma would finish me before I could finish this race. I lost friends by the block. In the end, it was us. The fattest girl and fattest boy in the class, and he chose silence and I chose comedy, so by default, I had more friends than him. Tatiana, they screamed. You better not let him beat you. We looked at each other, began our interpretation of running. Go, Tatiana, go, Tatiana. I could hear a few of his friends. Go, Wilson. I beat him. I wasn't slow, I was just fat. That is the only other time I can think of me running, other than from this poem. By luck, I escaped type 1. I feel like I'm always one soda away from type 2, and that's like dodging a bullet and committing suicide with a gun in my kitchen. Feels a lot like the shooting range these days. Feels a lot like the mile these days. I wish my emotions wasn't so invested, so I can write the most eloquent poem about type 2, tell you all its facts, hit you in the gut with reality. But the stats don't tell my story. Oh, I can feel the sun kissing my face. Hear my grandpa trod up the creaky steps, the smell of oil and dough, enjoying my breakfast. Every day before school was a dozen donut holes. My grandfather created a tragic tradition. Rarely said I love you, but made a sanctuary out of Saturdays for us. Took the long way to McDonald's so we could giggle and gather up our hunger. I learned to find I love you in white paper bags instead of his lips. See, I loved food out of ritual. This is about me and obesity, how those concepts aren't always separate, how to measure myself from my measurements, not panic when my friends park close to the curb, because I don't just tip the scale, I tip the car. This is about how I starve myself before blood work, praying it doesn't pick up the candy from my last time of the month. This is me praying I don't forget diabetes knocked 2 uncles off their feet and one is barely standing. This is my battle between diet and dialysis, about being stuck between 2 Burger King kings and never having it your way. This is a lot like middle school, like running, like a Wilson being diabetes, and me praying that I beat it.
Before I ask you about what it made you feel and what you think her message was, I want to point something out. We've probably been thinking about obesity completely the wrong way, for those of you who follow the nutrition science. I just want to point out, give you a term which you can then Google and look up yourself, the carbohydrate insulin model. Has anybody heard of the carbohydrate insulin model? Google it. David Ludwig wrote an article, I think it was in New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA, that really outlines how a calorie is not a calorie, how different food types and different ways of delivering that food, specifically carbohydrates with high glycemic load, lead to a cycle of obesity, hunger, and inability to lose weight, and a desire to have more simple carbohydrates, and all the metabolic dysfunction that is a consequence. In other words, obesity is not the end product or the driver of the diabetes epidemic, but is simply a bystander in the pathophysiology between diet and diabetes. It's just a bystander, not the cause. So the carbohydrate insulin model, look it up. Okay, how did this one make you feel?
I felt very empathetic for her journey, and just some of my personal experiences where you feel like you're kind of on this vicious circle or cycle where you're trying. You feel like you've made some progress, but then you realize you're still in the same place. But like her, I don't give up. And so that's why I really identified with the young lady and what she was sharing. Even though she said about the longest mile that she was going to jog it, then she walked it. But at no point did she say, I gave up. Mm-hmm. She keeps trying. Mm-hmm. And to me, that in of itself is a victory, because we can't gauge our successes against other people. It's about you and where you are and what you know, right, and how you apply that knowledge.
So that's beautiful. So if we could use the language of the values that I talked to you about before, there was a little bit of defiance in that, right? Which is, I'm not giving up.
Right, and she was, even though she wasn't necessarily where she wanted to be, I would say that she had made herself comfortable and defiant and accept me for who I am and where I am.
So that's what I wanted. That was the next thing I wanted to ask you. So you said you identified with her.
Yes.
What did you feel about her presentation of her identity? Right? Fat, blonde. Mm-hmm. She said she's fat. I mean, how did you integrate how she self-identified and how that somehow enabled you to identify with her?
I think that for her as well as for myself, that even though by society's terms she might not be perceived as being attractive or whatever, but she's saying, I have blonde hair, which is going to make you see me even more than the size that I am. But know this, I embrace who I am. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, I'm going to make the best of where I am, who I am, and too bad that society doesn't see my beauty. I do.
And how courageous that is to do as in high school, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
It was powerful.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Speak up if you could. Yeah.
What bothered me the most is that through the whole picture, she's putting in the front the refreshment. Every time she says something,
There's a drink.
is on the first name. I don't know if that's the word you use.
Yeah, it is.
And she's struggling with it, but everything is still on in front of her.
So how did that make you, what was the feeling that evoked? What was the feeling that evoked?
You're always attached with kids doing that because it's good for him.
You can't escape that, you're saying, which is the point, I think, the trap, the feeling trap.
All over you, it's wrong, so even if you try, they're putting another thing.
Yeah. Yeah, for those of you who have young children who play soccer, right? It's like, okay, break time. We've been running for 15 minutes. Here comes the Gatorade. I'm like, they've been running for 15 minutes. Like, it's not, the Olympics here. Yeah. So we have been conditioned. Okay. Yes. Yeah, go ahead, stand, and then behind you.
I like how she was calling out the message. That one line about being stuck between two Burger Kings, but never having it my way.
Right. That was a beautiful twist on marketing, right? Never having it my way. Of course, you're always having it your way. That's their message, right? That was really brilliant. In the orange or red, and then the next orange red.
Well, I feel very angry and frustrated when we live in a country where money reigns supreme. All of a sudden at a game where you can only afford dollar meals. I think you're on the right path with fear.
Influence, yeah.
Influence, the man that wrote the ethical brain, because it's ethics, genetics, and then fear. And then, like, goes through. So really hopeful that that's spread and
So I want two responses to that. Thank you for bringing that up. Again, we have sort of the anger and the frustration and almost the cynicism, right? How can we, right? So I'm going to ask again, how can a public health campaign be successful if its message is anger, frustration, and cynicism? How do you guys, what do you think about that, right? That's not our usual go-to place. Yeah, and then I'm going to come back to you at the mic, but yeah.
Partly it's because it acknowledges the anger and frustration and cynicism that people have in dealing with it. So it's empowering.
Right, by calling out the true, right, which is in counterpoint to diet and eat right, exercise. Those are the messages we get, right? Be healthy. Go get those stretch pants and join the gym. Which I think people's experience has been one of frustration with that. And to get back to Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal, we're in a situation that calls for a revolution, really. I mean, we're talking about changing the food system here. That's not like someone passes a bill and we're done. That is deeply ingrained global economics. So I think strategically, everything else feels like it's on the margins, right? So I think what she's saying is yeah, we got to get mad. Oh, I'm sorry, the peer thing. I want to say one thing about the peer thing. What we've learned, I keep saying I'm going to come back to you. What we've learned is, particularly with young people, telling them to eat right and exercise, the proverbial spitting in the wind, right? Showing them this video in which we never say don't eat soda or M&Ms or whatever, as I will show you in a minute, makes young people think critically about what they're doing because they don't want to be part of the problem, right? They don't want to be controlled by the man. So we have found, at least among the poets and those who've been engaged in the campaign, that they have changed their habits not because we ever told them to, but because they realize they're being played, and they don't want to be played.
I was just going to say the part that spoke to me was showing love through food, where he talked about the grandparent bringing the donuts, and then there was a writing at the end that talked about sort of the inability to afford other activities to do as a family, as they would walk to McDonald's every Saturday, and that was their form of love and entertainment.
Yes.
So it just made me think.
So yeah, it's a very powerful set of images. The grandfather coming, who's not affectionate but shows his affection through the donuts. I mean, if you look at Coca-Cola's marketing campaign, particularly in Latin America, it is that. It's to become a member of the family, to become a member who sits at every meal with you. You cannot have a family meal without a bottle of Coca-Cola there to accompany you. So the idea of family, love, food, beverage, sweets, essentially a fiesta with every meal, where it used to be 3 or 4 times a year, now it's every meal. And so how do you counter that when people begin to see this as our cultural way of life that's been imposed on us? Okay, public health message. We've been steering towards it, but were there any other public health messages that you heard her call out? Yes, in the back. Could you go to the mic? Yeah, thanks.
It's a public health message, but you have the young Hispanic man, and he did his poem, he did his presentation, and there was a success story. He's working now, he's married, and that's good. I'd like to have the follow-up on the young African-American.
Oh, she's doing great. She's a social worker, she's a performer, she's doing great.
So that one event helped her get out of that.
Oh, I can't say if the event did. I mean, these kids are very gifted, talented, the best poets of Youth Speaks in the Bay Area. They're on Youth Speaks this is what Youth Speaks does. They help kids get on a train to success. So I'm happy we were part of that, but I can't take credit.
Has it been able to change her lifestyle, her eating habits and things like that?
I don't know so much with her. I can tell you that Erica Shepard, who was the initial poet, her poem is called Death Recipe. And it's about her struggle with obesity and self-image. She lost like 200 pounds within the next 2 years. She's also now in healthcare. She's studying to be, I think, a nurse practitioner. But I think that's very difficult to do for people with, especially for people with obesity. Okay. But she's doing great, and she's going to be fine.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let's continue. So how do we get these messages out? I mean, our bread and butter vehicle, of all things, is actually high school assemblies and recesses. How many of you remember any content from a high school assembly you attended? I mostly remember spitballs, but so you got 10 hands went up. We take the hour assembly and we're given free rein, and we have poets doing poems, and we have PowerPoints, we show the maps, and I'll show you some of the evaluation results. Also live performances in concert halls, social media, as I've shown you, and we're very opportunistic about putting the young people in front of policymakers, particularly when there are times of important votes related to public health in the Bay Area. The young people have become activated in other ways. This is a 20-foot inflatable in Dolores Park in San Francisco to make a point. Here are the evaluation results of the bigger picture high school assembly. Again, remember, it's not like the ideal pedagogical setting, these high school assemblies, right? But what we found was after these performances, significantly more young people, we've now done this with over 3,000 young people, agreed that diabetes is preventable compared to before. Most importantly, a significant majority now believed that environmental causes influence risk for diabetes, as only 34% believed that before compared to 83%. And then after the assembly, 59% compared to 29% cared a lot. These are just straight up high school students in public high schools in San Francisco, cared a lot about diabetes prevention. By that meaning you'd want to join a club or some extracurricular activity to change your community or your school. The campaign has had relatively high levels of reach to date, despite us having absolutely no marketing budget. Greater than 7,500 high school students in the Bay Area have been exposed to these assemblies. We've trained 50 poet mentors in 8 poet workshops. Half of them have been turned into video poems. Presented to numerous folks like yourselves. Have had now almost 2 million video views, and a statewide partner expansion, wherein we partnered with other spoken word organizations in California, including with Our Words in Stockton, which is where Anthony Orozco's poem came from, to replicate the campaign in other localities in California. It's, as I said earlier, very powerful to have a poem that shows a particular corner on a particular street that every kid knows and recognizes as their own. We've also been fortunate to partner with some local health departments around their non-communicable disease campaigns. I'll show you some of the swag that has been created and been posted in buses and subway stops, and have had a lot of great earned media. Every time a new poem comes out, we send it out, and hopefully someone picks it up and interviews the poet. And you know, poets are poets. They're artists. They want to be seen and read and heard. And you know, getting 40,000 hits after a Huffington Post story about your poem is a real high for these young people. The filmmaker is amazing, and he's won film festivals. Not quite the Cannes Film Festival, but the Food Farm Films Festival, the Real Food Media Contest, the American Public Health Association. So I think the art is being appreciated for what it is, not just public health awards. Here's our young people being featured on the buses and subways for the Open Truth campaigns of Alameda County, Sonoma County, and San Francisco County, with links to their videos. Here's the New York Times cover story. And I want to just share with you some emerging research, and then I'll wrap up. So we wanted to know, okay, this is cool, we show it to you guys, you kind of get it, you feel it in your heart, you feel it in your mind, but what do low-income youth of color see when they watch the bigger picture videos? And how do they think about diabetes? And so we did a qualitative study where we brought in about 20 young people of color, ages 16 to 21, and presented the content in 2 formats. One was on your own watching the video, like you would if it were on your phone. And then we asked them a whole bunch of questions about what they saw, what they understood, what they felt. And then brought them together in 2 focus groups, separate focus groups, and had a facilitator facilitate a conversation about what it was that they saw and heard and felt. And we analyzed their responses, their qualitative responses, and we noticed that young people were either taking away from these poems, health literacy messages, but they were either framed as individual health literacy messages, like, I need to change what I'm eating. Or, that kid's eating she's drinking a lot of soda. No wonder she's overweight. Or, right? That individual frame. Or young people were doing more the public health literacy frame, like, can you imagine all the marketing that's going on in Stockton, California, and those junk food places? That's not right, that the community should have zoning laws. So the different ways of thinking about health literacy, one at an individual level and one at the public health level. And what we noticed was, if you look here at this pictorial, the green and yellow coded bubbles represent individual health literacy statements, whereas the orange and red ones represent public health literacy statements. And as you'll see, the individual responses were kind of equally divided between kids taking home individual health literacy messages as much as public health literacy messages. Whereas when there was a focus group discussion where kids were bouncing things off of each other, there was a much greater tendency to see diabetes as a communal, societal, public health problem with public health solutions. Which is probably not that surprising for those of you who understand the power of focus groups, but has real implications for how we think about transmitting public health literacy content, whether it's online or in performances, and the importance of having an interactive discussion like the one we've had today to a certain degree to enable the socio-ecological model, which is not our go-to place in America, to emerge, if that makes sense. Now, so that's one emerging area of research. The second area that we've just completed a study on that I'll share with you, and it's kind of cool, was we wanted to know how can we maximize the reach of a public health literacy campaign using social media. We have a social media website, we have a Facebook page, we have these great videos, we think. People seem to like them when they watch them and share them when they watch them. How can we get more eyeballs on them? And not just with the usual suspects. How can we actually get the average American to watch these and to begin to reframe the diabetes problem away from it being a medical disease to becoming thought of as a social ill, which is what, again, all of these videos are trying to convey. So we asked the question of, could we compare different ways of framing the epidemic of diabetes in youth to learn how to expose as many people to the socio-ecological model as presented in these videos, to increase their public health literacy and to motivate action and policy change among the average person. So to do this, we partnered with our Russian friends at Facebook and studied a little bit about framing, how you frame messages, like politicians do. How are we going to frame the abortion issue? How are we going to frame the border wall issue in a way that will get most voters to vote for it? So 9 different ways of framing the diabetes epidemic in young people based on communication theory to motivate individuals to click on links to bigger picture videos and the bigger picture website. So our outcome is, did you go to the bigger picture website and watch stuff? So, but what we're really asking here is, how do you frame a message to get people to watch? Not the content of what they're watching, it's the content of the framing, which is usually like a 6 or 8 word thing, right? We then took these frames and exposed them to 6 different unique audience segments that Facebook allows you to define. So if you're an advertiser on Facebook, which we now are considered an advertiser on Facebook, you go to the ad tool and you can say, you know what, I want people who like to run, who like vegetarian food, who, there are characteristics that you can choose, and you can create a segment of the population. So that's what we did, and we ran 6 parallel randomized controlled trials within each segment of society and exposed them to these different ways of framing the diabetes epidemic. So just to show it to you visually, on the y-axis we have the audience subtypes. We had youth, we have those that we define as being interested in social justice issues, public health people, people interested in nutrition like organic food and cooking, philanthropists or donors, benevolent people, and then, this is a euphemism, sorry, individualists, people who believe in picking yourself up by the bootstraps, tend to be members of the NRA or vote Republican, but you can't select for those things on Facebook. But we selected for things that were suggested that people were more individualist rather than communally oriented. And we exposed them to different ways of framing the epidemic. First was more of like a military metaphor, diabetes as a war, and we're soldiers in the war. Okay, do you want to watch this video? How these young people are soldiers in the war. Defiance versus authority, we had a frame around that. Pure entertainment, watch how a star is born. The secondhand smoke equivalent, is diabetes like the new secondhand smoke? A play on genetics. Oh, you think diabetes is based on genetics? Watch this young person tell her story. You think everybody's got the choice to eat right and exercise? Watch this. Play on personal responsibility. Do you want to know how much money we could save in America in healthcare costs if diabetes went away? Talking to the pocketbook, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what we found. Highlighted in red, here higher numbers are better. And each audience sample involved 5,000 people on Facebook. So we've got 5,000 people being exposed to these frames, these ad frames, and being enticed to click on the link and watch videos and go to the bigger picture website. And what we found, if you look in red, was remarkable uniformity across these subgroups of these, the marketing people say you got to segment your audience, segment your audience. Well, actually, we found the opposite was true by and large, that the highest numbers of reach in red here tended to fall into one of three categories of framing the diabetes epidemic. One was the defiance against authority message, which, believe it or not, the individualists, the philanthropists, the nutritionists, the public health people, and the social justice people all really liked. Or, next most popular, the secondhand smoke equivalent, the young person as an innocent victim of an environmental problem. And lastly, pure entertainment. People like to be entertained. Watch How a Star is Born. Those were the most popular frames across almost all subtypes. What about the least popular ways of framing the epidemic? Well, turns out healthcare costs, not that popular, even among the individualists who really don't like to pay taxes. Facts and figures, not surprisingly, not helpful. Social and racial injustice, not so much, not even among the social justice people. What we found in some was that defiance against authority, entertainment, and secondhand smoke seem to be the most effective ways to get people to watch content that describes diabetes as a social problem. In the interest of time, I'm going to close with a final quote from Paulo Freire, who asked, "How can the oppressed participate in developing the pedagogy of their liberation? This pedagogy makes oppression and its causes objects of reflection by the oppressed. And from that reflection will come their necessary engagement in the struggle for their liberation. And in the struggle, this pedagogy will be made and remade." So this, I believe, addresses the concern that you raised around what can we do about this? This feels so big. And I think what Freire is saying is it is this reflection of how big this is that comes the necessary engagement for the struggle for liberation. So I'll close there, and I really appreciate your attention and your participation. Thank you.